Imagine if it had,
Sorry.
imagine, it's all right. Imagine if the railroad had passed 6 miles to the west as it was originally planned. Fortunately, it did not, and it went through Decatur, and Decatur has made good use of the railroad over the years. Consider this. In the 1930s, Wabash Railroad, which was not the only railroad in Decatur, Wabash alone employed over 4,500 people and was the largest employer in the entire city of Decatur. And consider this. Wherever you are in Decatur, whichever street you live on, you can hear the trains from your home. Some closer, but there are tracks in every direction here. And consider this, when you drive to and from work from your home, you're almost certain to either cross tracks or go over or under the tracks. 170 years later, we're still very much dependent upon the railroad, as we will hear tonight. And now Pat Riley is going to talk to us about the history of the tracks and where the current tracks, railroad tracks, lie today.
Yeah, the railroad tracks coming into Decatur come from the west. The first one in here was the Wabash, but they could have been in here in 1853, but they had trouble at Stevens Creek. They had trouble with the bridge, trouble with employees. They had two different groups of employees. They would fight amongst each other, get drunk and stuff that were building the bridge. And as they came in, before they got to Decatur, some of the rail originally was wood with metal strips on top, but by the time that in the 1850s they were using solid rail, and they come in basically where they are today for Norfolk Southern, and left about the same. The bridges that they built, the bridge at the Sangamon River, which is now Lake Decatur, that bridge to the east was 20 feet lower than what the one is today. And it was like a dish. They had trouble getting in and out. And the rails from the north and south on the IC, that was a land grant railroad that some people do not know. The Wabash was privately bought. It didn't get grants from the government, and a grant railroad got land on each side, on the opposite sides every other mile or so, as part of the deal to build the railroad. And that was actually done through Abraham Lincoln when he was in Congress and stuff. But the rails at the Wabash interlocking, or the interlocking down there by the depot, that was the first place that rails crossed in Illinois together, instead of other ways like Chicago, and then they used switches to get from one railroad to the other. But Decatur was the first one. And as they grew, industry grew, the road checker and different things, a lot of agricultural industry was started here because they could go east and west or north and south. These lines connected from Decatur to main points was water points, so they could load and unload off of ships or boats to begin with. And the industrial lines they built right along the railroad tracks at Morgan Street, which is closed off. Originally there was 8 tracks there along the Wabash, and some of them were industrial, but two of them were mainline tracks. And then they had an extra track for the passenger depot. Also, on down, they had tracks all the way down to do in different industries, and they would switch those industries different times of the day. These pictures of the rail gangs. This is from 1935, around that time, when this is actually out at B-Mint area. They were double tracking. They double tracked in the 30s to B-Mint, and used 112-pound rail, which was heavy rail for that time. It was 15 miles that they had double track, or roughly 15 miles. It might be a little bit less or a little bit more, so that they can move trains better in and out. And that's where they connected with the line to Chicago, so they could come into Decatur. It's easier to move the trains from Chicago into Decatur, plus from the east from over around Lafayette, Peru, Indiana, as far as Detroit. And the IC went from Chicago to, they could actually go all the way to New Orleans. And the Wabash went Detroit or Buffalo, New York to Kansas City. Also, we had the Illinois Terminal, which started out as Illinois Traction. It had lighter rail, but they did a lot of express freight. You could run, say, from Decatur or Danville, Peoria to St. Louis overnight, and sort of like UPS or one of them today, only they did it by rail, and then they would catch up with the buggies or teamsters that would load that stuff on their wagons and deliver it to people, or you'd have to go down to the depot and get it yourself. And that's about all I have to say about things.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Now we're going to talk about the history of the depots and significant railroad buildings here in Decatur. The original depot in Decatur was the Union Depot, built in 1854 to serve the Great Western Railroad, our original railroad service. Here you see a picture of it. As you see, it was built in 1853, and it was torn down in 1901. By 1901, the Great Western had consolidated with the Wabash Railroad, and that year, at a cost of $70,000, they built the Wabash Depot that we know and which still stands today, although it looks a little different. That's the Illinois Central Depot you see in that picture there. In 1994, the Wabash Depot was added to the National Register of Historic Places. It was designed back in 1901 by a St. Louis architect named Theodore Link in the classic revival style. Inside, again, that's a picture of the Illinois Central. Inside the Wabash Depot was the ticket booth and various offices. There was a restaurant to eat, a news and cigar stand called the Union Newsstand, and a small store where one might purchase a watch or have one repaired. The restaurant was called the Wabash Dining Room, and in the 1915 newspaper was an ad where they were looking for 2 waitresses to be paid 25 cents an hour, and it said, "Come to the depot at 10 o'clock and be ready to work." So apparently they needed a couple of waitresses that day. In the late 40s, the full restaurant, which was at the west end of the building, was downsized to become a lunch counter. If you look at this picture here, you can see it was taken in the wintertime, and you see the snow on the grounds, and you can see the Wabash Depot, and perpendicular to that, you'll see in a north-south direction, you'll see, if you go back to that picture, please, you'll see the IC the Illinois Central Depot, and they had the baggage building next to it, and then alongside it also was, or on the other side of El Dorado Street was the freight building. You'll also, can we go back to that picture before, please? Okay. A newspaper article, there it is, thank you. Down, if you look at the building on the south of the, I guess on the north of the railroad tracks, you see what looks like a big house or a big building there, and that was the Railroad YMCA, and we'll talk about that in just a second. The Wabash Depot had 2 stairways to the 2nd floor, and upstairs there was 14 offices where the railroad division superintendent was, a chief dispatcher with 5 dispatchers on each of 3 shifts. There was a telegraph manager, a general roadmaster, a resident engineer, and a fuel inspector. Beside the Wabash Depot was the Railway Express Agency building, which again still stands today. If we can go on to the next picture. At one time, there was also a freight house on the other side of the tracks. And let's take a moment, let's talk about the Railroad YMCA, which, as I say, was on the north side of the tracks. It included a sleeping dormitory and rooms for 32 men, a 24-hour restaurant, a library, and a gymnasium. The building was in use for 60 years and was torn down in 1962. In the year 1918, it had 90,376 visitors. Railroaders who were passing through the town could stay there at the Railroad YMCA. And during the war, soldiers who were traveling through Decatur were also allowed to stay there as well. To the east of the Wabash Depot was the Illinois Central, or known as the IC. Its baggage house still stands today, as well as the freight house. It was a large depot. It was 294 feet long, and it had 2 separate waiting rooms to handle the passengers who were going north and south. You may ask, why was there 2 separate depots? And the answer to that is because there were trains coming in 2 separate directions, and in the early 1900s, the Wabash had as many as 25 passenger trains a day. The Illinois Central had as many as 18 a day. And as Dale Jenkins will talk to us, the interurban also was operating, and there were a great many trains coming and going through there as well. The other thing I want to talk about is the Wabash train shops. In 1908, the Wabash train shop buildings were completed, and it was there that the work was done on locomotives and other train cars. In 1924, there was a major fire at the train shops, and they had to be rebuilt. The entire train shops were modernized and expanded in 1954. In the 1930s, as I said, the Wabash employed over 4,500 people. The Wabash car shops from Peoria had been relocated to Decatur, as well as the Springfield car shops, which were brought to Decatur. And so there was a great deal of work that was being done here in Decatur on both the railroad cars and also on the locomotives. One of the things I want to mention in part of the PowerPoint, which we're having a little bit of technical difficulty, is that we've got Dwayne Shepard has done a lot of, there you can see some of the ads there. That's the Railway Express building, the other side of the Railway Express building. You can see some of the people working for the Railway Express and one of the trucks. So during the war, if you go back to that picture, if you can, people who had idle tires, in other words, more than the 4 tires plus the spare for their car, were directed to bring their tires down to the Railway Express building, and in turn they would be shipped off to the government. This is a Wabash freight building, and I believe, and I might be corrected, I think that might have been on the other side of the tracks from the depot. Another freight building you can see there. And we have some pictures of some of the model buildings that have been built by Dwayne Shepard. Dwayne has an incredible collection of model of trains, and also that's there's Dwayne, and you can see some of his buildings that he's got built there, and he's got them, and they're just absolutely beautiful, and they look very, very realistic. We're going to go now to Mike Jacobs, and Mike is going to talk about the history of freight service in Decatur. Mike, you have to unmute yourself.
How's that? I'm sorry about that. I'm here. Can you hear me? Okay. Gary?
Mike, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. But I'm just going to expound on what everybody was talking about with the various lines. The Illinois Central at one time would leave Decatur in about 5 or 6 different directions. The line that went up 48 could go up to Champaign and points beyond, and then head up toward Chicago. The other line that went north, and some of us still remember the line that went through Maroa, Forsyth. That was the Illinois Central and the Illinois Terminal. But the Illinois Central went as far north as Freeport. The active line that's still running right now goes up to Peoria. That goes along 121 through Warrensburg, Mount Pulaski. And then the other line that leaves south out of Decatur and then goes through Mount Zion, goes down to Mattoon, and then down to Effingham and joins the main line of the Illinois Central, which is now the Canadian National. Now, Wabash has Wabash turned into the Norfolk and Southern. Wabash is my grandfather's railroad. It has 4 different districts in the Decatur area. The Bloomington district, which also serves Peoria. It also, the Lafayette, which goes up through Danville up to Lafayette. And then you've got what's called the Brooklyn district. There's a town in the St. Louis area called Brooklyn, so it's named after that, called the Brooklyn district. So it goes towards the St. Louis metro area. And then the other one is they call it the Springfield Hannibal district, and it goes all as far out as Kansas City. So we still have plenty of rail service and a lot of connections, a lot of railroads interchange cars. Even the railroads in town interchange cars between each other. And what I mean by interchanging is that they hand off cars to them that they can ship to places on their system that the other railroad can't, and they return the favor both ways. So that's how. And then up till 2018, there was the B&O. I almost left up B&O, which turned into the CSX, and the CSX basically went straight over to Index at one time. Now, the term 2018, the CSX to leave the Decatur area and the Decatur line that goes out Route 36 East, and a new company, the parent company is called Watco, came to town, and the local branch is called Decatur and Eastern Illinois Railroad. And they have really they've turned a profit. And at one time, in the last few years, they were the best performing unit of the entire Watco family. So, but back to the B&O, back when it was the B&O, it used to get on the Wabash line and go down to Moody, Illinois, then over to Springfield. So Illinois is really the melting pot of almost a lot of the railroads across the country. They all kind of meet, and Decatur being the biggest, what's called biggest rail yard between Chicago and St. Louis, and we are the biggest flat yard in the United States. And what I mean by flat is they switch it without any type of what's called a hump yard, where it rolls down a hill and is classified into different switches. But we do as flat, so just picture a flat railroad with no hills or no way of rolling a car over a hill and down to the track they wanted to go into. So Decatur does have a distinction of having the biggest yard in the country. That's a flat yard. So, anybody have any questions or anything like that?
Thank you, Mike. We appreciate it. Now we're going to hear from Steve Huss about the history of passenger service to Decatur, as well as some of the more interesting people who have come through Decatur.
When you think of Decatur passenger service, Wabash is the first one to come to mind. We also had passenger service on the Illinois Central and the Pennsylvania and the Baltimore and Ohio and the Illinois traction system, which is the electric interurban, and lastly on Amtrak. I grew up in Decatur and was introduced to the Wabash and the Illinois Central early in life when we would travel to Chicago to see the relatives. And I did a lot of train watching from my dad's factory next to the Wabash on Church Street. I recall riding on trains, and that when you would go from car to car, you would have to have good balance because you were jostling around, opening one door, getting in a little space between the cars, and then opening another door. I also remember going to the bathroom, and when you flushed the toilet, you could see the rocks, the ballast rocks. So there was no sanitary containment system, apparently, on the trains I used to ride on. Some of these pictures will be redundant, but they're just to make a point about the passenger service. So you can go on the IC passenger station there. Now, Baltimore and Ohio passengers could come here from Indianapolis. They could board and go to Booty and Mount Auburn and Roby, Illinois, and Rochester and Beardstown. The B&O did use the Wabash station on East Saragordo, this station right here. City directory showed a passenger service for the B&O in Decatur as late as 1951, although I think it terminated slightly before that. Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed through Decatur in 1936 on the B&O en route to Indianapolis. And this is an aerial view that shows the Wabash station in current times. And it shows to the left the Wabash intersection of the Illinois Central, which is Canadian National now, and the Wabash tracks. And right there where the red buildings are and slightly closer to the tracks, was where the station was that Gary talked about, the Union Depot, which was taken down about 1900. There was a rate schedule from 1936 in the Herald Review that showed that the B&O ride from Decatur to Springfield cost 90 cents, but their cars were air conditioned. B&O operated through Decatur since 1927. In 1946, there was a daily passenger service to Indianapolis with 20 stops. That'd be a long ride. In 1946, the Decatur to Springfield route had no passengers. It only had freight. And the Wabash, there is a historical debate as to which railroad arrived first in 1854. Most accounts say the first train was a Wabash, but I have read where the IC contested that and skipped crossing over the river north of town and started putting tracks at the intersection. That was a short-term thing. The Great Western Railway arrived in May of 1854, and the IC apparently arrived 5 months later. with cars. The first, the station, the Wabash station, is at 780 East Cerro Gordo. It was built in 1901, and at its peak, there were a lot of daily passenger trains. I heard a number today of like 24 or 25, and I saw a number in one article as high as 72, which sounds probably not believable, but some of the trains that came through here were through trains, and they really didn't stop. Many of us rode the Wabash to Chicago and St. Louis. I remember in first grade, the parents drove us to Taylorville, and we got on the Wabash train at Taylorville and got a train ride to the Decatur Wabash station. Now, that was about 1956. I rode the train also, the Wabash train, a few times from Purdue University at Lafayette, Indiana, to and from Decatur in the couple of years before it stopped forever. It had dome cars and cool names like Banner Blue, Bluebird, Cannonball. The Wabash merged into N&W in 64 and then into the NNS, Norfolk and Southern, in 82. Now, the Illinois Central, this is go back to that shot. That was a locomotive that was here. It was the Green Diamond Illinois Central. I believe it was a demonstration train. It was a diesel electric train and as far back as 1936. And this was at the Illinois Central Station in Decatur. The Green Diamond was a well-known name for the Illinois Central passenger service. And as a family, we used to go up to Clinton in the car and take the Green Diamond from Clinton to South Chicago and Homewood, Illinois, to see the relatives. The Illinois Central passenger service to Decatur had discontinued by 1940. Hold that for just a little bit. The Illinois Central Station, but was continued to be used by the Pennsylvania Railroad until 1949. Then in 51, that beautiful Illinois Central Station was raised. That south building of the station that Gary referred to, that last remnant of the Illinois Central Station with tile roof, apparently is there because it was used by Rath Packing. That's one story I found. And the other one was that it was used by the Railroad Express Agency. So it was not raised when the rest of the structure was. Now, the Pennsylvania Railroad, now on this advertisement for Baltimore and Ohio, it does reveal that in this time frame in 1936, they had air-conditioned service. It says all principal B&O trains carry air-conditioned individual seat coaches. And there's a rate schedule, and it shows that if you went to Indianapolis from Decatur, the new fare was $3.10. So now the Pennsylvania Railroad reached Decatur in 1893 by acquisition of what was called the Vandalia Railroad. This allowed passenger service from Terre Haute to Decatur to Peoria. The Pennsylvania used the Illinois Central tracks from nearby Hervey City to Maroa. The Pennsylvania used the Illinois Central Station on Front Street. The last passenger train from Decatur to Peoria was 1932, but the last passenger train from Decatur to Terre Haute and back was 1949. Gary did show a beautiful picture of an Illinois Central passenger train in front of that Illinois Central Station. Now, to finalize passenger service to Decatur, the Wabash and then the Norfolk and Western ceased passenger service to Decatur in 1971. Decatur was left out when Amtrak was formed, choosing the Bloomington to Springfield to Chicago route due to a greater market potential. The N&W passenger service was a loser financially, so it was dropped. Local and state officials fought to prevent this. And finally, 10 years later, after it was discontinued, in March of 1981, service to Chicago was extended from Champaign on the train that had been traveling from Chicago to Champaign. The train was called the Illini. And then the Illini started coming to Decatur, and the first Illini run to Decatur was July 10 of 81. 2 years later, not even just 22 months, this all failed in 1983. There were ridership goals for the 2 years of the Amtrak service, and we were averaging 35 passengers a day when the goal was 40 to 50. Initially in 1980, that's just before the Illini started coming to Decatur, Amtrak had a bus that could take you to Lincoln, but hardly anyone used it. The Reagan administration was not supportive. The Reagan administration wanted to slash Amtrak funding. And Decatur's last passenger train returned from Chicago on Sunday night, July 10, 1981. I was going to, as this heading notes, famous railroad visitors through Decatur, there certainly were a lot more famous people that stopped here on trains or went through on trains than I certainly came up with. But first mention was President Rutherford Burchard Hayes in 1880, but I really could not find any data on that other than just the mention of it. Now, regarding Abraham Lincoln, there's Rutherford Hayes. Regarding Abraham Lincoln, his funeral train, of course, toured good parts of the United States, but it never came through Decatur. It completed its journey from Chicago to Springfield, never traveling through Decatur. Abraham Lincoln did arrive for a political rally in 1856 on a Great Western train, later the Wabash Line. He had been in Danville and stayed when he got to Decatur at the Castle House in downtown Decatur area. And then the next day, he proceeded by rail to Bloomington. The story of Ulysses Grant is pretty interesting. He visited here October 6, 1880 for a reunion of Civil War veterans. He arrived on the Wabash from Chicago. The Wabash came down to Bement, where James Milliken and Governor General Oglesby boarded and accompanied him to Decatur to the Union Depot. The engine was encountered by so many people that there was concern about injuries, so the engine backed up swiftly, and then they brought a carriage out to the train, and then in the carriage, Grant went to Governor Oglesby's house in West William Street, which is still there, and then went to the James Milliken home, which is still there and is the James Milliken homestead, and then went to what is now Fairview Park, to the fairgrounds, where this large reunion of Civil War veterans was taking place. He subsequently returned by train to Chicago at 10:40 p.m. He had spoken a grand total of 156 words in Fairview Park that day. The picture here, probably hard to see, maybe it shows William McKinley, President William McKinley, on October 16th, 1898. The crowd was estimated to be 15,000 to 20,000. He arrived on a Vandalia train, but after his speech, he was put on a Wabash train and went to Springfield. He also was here another year, and that was 1892, traveling to Decatur on the Wabash. Now, Theodore Roosevelt arrived in Decatur from Springfield June 4, 1903, for a very specific purpose. He had come to dedicate the new Milliken University. His Wabash train arrived from Springfield. It was switched on to the St. Louis branch tracks. This branch was entered just a little bit east of what I think of as the Polar Ice Company, the ice house about Van Dyke and El Dorado. This train then backed up all the way to Milliken University, right by the intersection of Oakland and Fairview, West Main Street. There was no viaduct there at that time. The crowds were almost unmanageable. The greeting committee included James Milliken and Albert Taylor, Milliken's first president, about 5,000 to 6,000 people. People arrived on many trains to get there. He then left by carriage, driven by a local veterinarian, to the Wabash Depot. He complimented our city, he complimented our trees, he complimented our new Carnegie Library, which was going to open 1 month later, and he complimented our unusual building known as the Transfer House. He then stood on the back platform of the Wabash train as it departed, waving to the crowds. Then William Taft was here in 1911. Dale Jenkins will elaborate on his visit. There's a few photos there showing President Taft. Franklin Roosevelt, I could not find verification of his actually stopping in Decatur, but he came through here on one time the Wabash, one time the B&O, 1 year 1920 and 1 year 1936. And then Herbert Hoover arrived at the Wabash Station June 17th, 1931. He spoke for 10 minutes. This was a whistle stop. He had arrived here from Danville. Harry Truman was here at least twice. Eleanor Roosevelt there. And October 12, 1948, a 20-minute stop by Harry Truman. There's Hoover there. His route was from Danville to Springfield, stopping in Decatur. The train stopped at the Morgan Street crossing. He was campaigning for the presidency in 1948. In 1952, he came through here, but he realized he wasn't going to get to be president of the United States again, so he was campaigning for Adlai Stevenson on that whistle stop tour. And the last one I have record of, which was Dwight Eisenhower. This is this is actually where the IC station is, where there's a huge crowd of people. There's Truman and his wife, Bess. And that time he was here campaigning for Stevenson. That was 1952. Close up of Harry Truman. Next. And okay, another one. Dwight Eisenhower and several of Dwight Eisenhower. And the train stopped at the Morgan Street crossing, which is a block away from the Wabash Station, which used to be a crossing street, but isn't now. His wife, Mamie, was present. The article went into great detail about the effort the Wabash made to be sure to shut off all freight service to make sure there were no glitches. I actually was taken to this by my mother and her friend, and I remember seeing people climbing power poles. And I probably was about 5 years old. And I do not know of any other famous people that were political people. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Steve. Next, we're going to hear from Dale Jenkins. Dale?
Still bring up the screen there. The only attraction, 1901. State of Illinois, there was no paved highways. There was dirt roadways, axle deep mud in springtime, clouds of dust in summertime, and unpassable snow drifts in wintertime. So we go to the next scene. Mr. William B. McKinley is the founder of the Illinois Traction System. And Mr. McKinley started building his empire from Danville going westward, linking the central Illinois cities with St. Louis, crossing the Mississippi River over the McKinley Bridge. By 1910, he had 550 miles of railroad. In our next scene, we see the 1904. The Illinois Traction comes to Decatur, and the transfer house will become the passenger station for the Illinois Traction. But by 1908, because of the number of urban cars and streetcar cars servicing the transfer house, they had to take and move south about 1 block to the corner of Wood and Water Street and open up a new station. This station is located just west of the courthouse, and nowadays is a parking lot, municipal parking lot. As we see in the next scene, the interior of the passenger station, there's 76 trains a day in 1910 serves Decatur. You think about that, 76 trains a day, originating, terminating, passing through Decatur, going to Danville, Champaign-Urbana, Bloomington, Peoria, Springfield, St. Louis. Because Decatur location centrally in the state, the system shops would be built here in Decatur, out there in East Garfield, which exists today as the Parks Warehouse. And the next scene inside the shop building, we see the equipment being maintained. And also you'll see a set of locomotives that were built here in Decatur shops for the Illinois Traction Freight Service. Speaking of freight service, the freight service is being developed by the Illinois Traction very on in the early years. So in 1911, they built a belt line, a freight belt line around Decatur city limits. What this did was eliminate the problems of tight street car curves and restrict ordinances from the city. And to this day, the segment of that belt line and the Stevenson Creek Bridge exist in Fairview Park as a hiking trail. We mentioned about President Taft. Mr. McKinley in 1904 would come represent the House of Representatives. And Mr. McKinley later on would become campaign manager for Howard Taft. With this, he invited Mr. Taft to come to Central Illinois and see what Central Illinois is like. And with this, he did come to Central Illinois. He made a speech at the transfer house, motored to the Milton University. And as you see here, sitting on Main Street is a special train that Mr. Taft would board and would ride to Springfield, Illinois to celebrate the Lincoln observation of Lincoln's birthday. Now, Mr. McKinley in 1920 would move up from the House of Representatives and would be elected to the U.S. Senate. But now, under the circumstances, because of the ownership of quite a bit of property, he had to put into a private fund, into a holding fund. And with this, he created the Illinois Power and Light Company, which today we know as being the Ameren Company. In 1930, streetcars are now being replaced by buses. And with this, the city wants the railroad to get the urbans off the streets. And with this, they moved the operation over to the Belt Line and opened up a passenger station on Van Dyke Street, which still exists today. December 7, 1941, the United States enters World War II. There at Illiopolis, one of the largest munitions manufacturing plant was built. But they needed to get the workers to the plant and back. And with this, the Illinois Terminal would operate ordnance trains out of Springfield, Decatur, transporting the workers to the plant and back home. You see here, this is a kind of an idea of what the cost to ride the Illinois Traction, the Illinois Terminal, from Decatur to these various points. And to the right, you see 2023, the dollar amount as it would be now. In the next scene, we look at the passenger service. Passenger service in 1924, we're down to 44 trains. In 1948, we're down to 26 trains. And what's happening, the automobile is becoming more and more inroads against the railroad passenger service. The railroad now has faced with the issue, what do we do? So they created this Streamliner train, which has been the most luxurious trains at the time. With this train, you could get board reclining seats, wide windows. You'd have air conditioning and really comfort the drive. So on November 7th, 1948, the city of Decatur starts running to St. Louis and back. But even then, that wasn't enough. So then on June the 10th, 1955, passenger service would cease to exist here in Decatur. And I point out Clarence J. Hill, the city passenger agent, who started his career in 1907 at the transfer house. He moved to the Wood Street station and then the Van Dyke Street station. But interesting was on the last day of service, he wasn't working because it was his day off. 1953, dieselization is coming to the Illinois Terminal. And of course, dieselization would make the electric operation obsolete. And with this, passenger service has ceased to exist altogether, with the last train leaving Springfield to St. Louis on March the 3rd of 1956. Now the passenger service is gone. The freight service is all that the Illinois Terminal has to offer. And the IT, a lot of people remember seeing the long trains here in Decatur, the blue ADM covered hoppers, and most notably blocked at 27th Street. But the IT would continue to operate until September 1st, 1981, when Norfolk Western will take ownership of the IT. Then on May the 1st, 1982, the only terminal will cease to exist, leaving behind the legacy of the road of personalized services. And with this, I might like to offer at the Montauk Railroad Museum this Saturday and Sunday is Railroad Days. This is an opportunity to come out for one fare, ride 4 different trains, ride motor cars, and have the experience of a lifetime railroading at the museum. So come join us at Monticello. Thank you.
Thanks, Dale. Appreciate that. The interurban, of course, is something that most of us didn't get a chance to see, but it was something that was really important in the city of Decatur for a great many years. Let's talk a little bit about railroad service today. And the first screen, you'll see that the United States dominates freight rail service today. We may not be at the top of the chain for passenger service compared with other countries, but we are with regards to freight. Well, we're having technical difficulty. I was hoping that you'd get to hear the some of the sound from this. Technical difficulty. I was hoping that you'd get to hear the some of the sound from this. The here in Decatur over the past 7 or 8 years, we've seen a growing presence of the intermodal freight. This is railroad cars that carry containers that will ultimately be placed on trucks or ships for further shipment or delivery. Earlier in the 2000s, the intermodal traffic was exceeded by freight load traffic by a margin of 2 to 1. By 2015, intermodal traffic had pulled even, and now intermodal traffic has surpassed train load car traffic. So intermodal traffic is very important. And if you stop and think about it, there is an intermodal facility up in Chicago, but with all of the congestion up in Chicago, Decatur makes a very nice alternative to move freight, particularly along the railroad tracks. Illinois has a network of approximately 10,000 miles of railroad tracks, 41 railroads currently operated in the state, 7 of which are Class 1 carriers. Chicago, obviously, is the largest U.S. rail gateway. There's 1,300 freight, passenger, and commuter trains that pass through the Chicago region every day. And so the need for traffic to pass through Illinois outside of the Chicago congestion is obvious. A statistic that I think is particularly important is that Illinois ranks first in the nation in freight rail volume. And so you can see some of these pictures here that are showing you the Midwest Inland Port, which is out near ADM here in Decatur, and you can get a chance to see how the facility works. They have these large containers. The containers can be taken and put on trucks. They can be put on trains. A lot of times you'll see the containers even one on top of another on rail cars as they pass through Decatur. Questions? Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask any of the participants? I've seen that there are some comments. Leonard, I saw that you commented that Barry Goldwater had passed through here. Oh, I didn't know that. It's very interesting to me. Are there any other questions, perhaps?
Yeah. Gary, it's Susan Turretts.
Yes.
Okay. I understand that Ben's Barn was built to feed railway workers. Do you know anything about the history of the relationship between Ben's Barn and the trains?
Susan, that's interesting to me. I do not know that. Of course, Ben's Barn was located on El Dorado, right there by the railroad tracks. So it would certainly make sense that there was some relationship between the restaurant and the railroad. However, there was about 3 different hotels that were situated more or less directly across the street from the Wabash Depot. The most well-known of those was the Kraft Hotel. And I think Steve Huss had a picture of the Kraft Hotel among his pictures. So with all those people staying at those hotels who basically were in between trains, it made sense for restaurants like Ben's Barn to be there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We have a question. Is there any place in Decatur yet that has, I didn't quite catch it, all of about the train service, I think, set up? I don't know that we have anything in the nature of a railroad museum in Decatur. Dale, is there anything of that sort? I suppose.
Closest thing's Monticello, isn't it?
Also, the Post Museum.
Right,
yes.
Monticello, and of course, the local history room of the Decatur Public Library is certainly a great source, as well as the museum out near the airport.
There used to be a caboose in Fairview Park. What happened to that?
I wonder about that. Dale,
They got vandalized and the city finally just scrapped it on the spot.
oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah, some kids burn it,
Oh,
burnt the inside up.
They had the caboose out in Atlantic, same problem. They scrapped it.
And, they asked about those hotels. A lot of railroaders, if they were single, they might have lived in those hotels when they were in town. Because if you lived within a mile, I think a mile and a half or something like that of the thing, when they called, they had to come and knock on your door if you didn't have a phone in the early days. So you could go to work.
Gary?
yes, Susan.
Susan again. I recently read Abraham Lincoln in Decatur by Otto Kyle, and I was very excited to read that the presidential train that left Springfield actually came through Decatur and stopped, and there were thousands of people who gathered around the train to see the president and shake hands with him. And I think that's a very exciting piece of history, and I just wanted to mention it.
Yes, thank you, Susan. That is correct. The train that Lincoln was on when he had been elected president, and he was going from Springfield to Washington, the train did stop in Decatur, and Lincoln did speak briefly. I believe it was Steve Huss. Maybe you can correct me. I think that was at the Morgan Street. Was where the train stopped when Lincoln was on it. Is that correct?
Gary, I cannot help you with that.
Okay. Well, anyway, I've read it as well, Susan, that the presidential train did stop in Decatur, and that Lincoln did speak. And I've also read that Lincoln rode on the trains between Springfield and Decatur, which would have relieved him from having to ride horseback. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. We appreciate that, and thank you to all of the participants, and thank you to Dwayne Shepard for all of the things that you've been doing in terms of making the models and allowing us to take some pictures of them and share them with everybody. So thank you again. There will be a replay will be available, and you can watch it if you get on through the library webpage. Many thanks to the Decatur Public Library and to Becky. Thank you. And to Melissa as well. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. We will be putting this on our YouTube page probably tomorrow. So, and I will blast it out probably Friday on our Facebook so that you guys know it's out there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, guys.